It's the Bird Emergency, the Monday Megaphone. I'm Grant Williams, and I'm joined today by Mr. Simon Holmes at court. And before we press the button, Simon said to me with a look of somewhat, I can't tell whether it was bemusement, puzzlement, or amazement. So here we are on a bird podcast talking energy. Well, yes, we're doing that because conservation and energy are inextricably linked, and many of you might know Simon from his very helpful presence on Twitter. That's certainly how I came about knowing about him. I didn't get him confused with his South Sydney Rugby League club brother. And Simon is the Smart Energy Council Director and a senior advisor with the Energy Transition Hub. That's to give him his titles. Simon, would you please introduce what those bodies are? And thank you for agreeing to be part of a Crazy Bird podcast.
Hey, Grant, and hey, everyone else out there. Thanks for having me on the show. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be have an opportunity to speak and have a chat in a very different forum. So the Smart Energy Council is a peak body for solar storage and smart energy management solutions that help pull the grid together as we transition to a low carbon electricity sector. And the Energy Transition Hub is I'm based out of the Melbourne University portion of that, but it's a initiative across Melbourne Uni, ANU, and a number of other Australian universities, and 3 German universities, and we study the social, technical, economic, and political barriers, challenges, opportunities for decarbonising the energy sector. So there's obviously a huge amount going on in that area, and some, in a lot of ways, Germany's ahead of us, but there's also some fair amount in common between the countries. So we've got a lot to learn from each other, and maybe one day Australia will be exporting lots and lots of clean energy to Germany as well. So there's that aspect of it. So they're two of the main things I do, but I also do a lot of researching and writing on energy transition and decarbonisation matters.
And that's how I came across you, because you're putting out a lot of information regularly on Twitter that I see, and it seems to be in a fashion that is easy to understand and seems to me to be reliable, which with a lot of energy commentary, I don't think that it can be called reliable. Now, I want to make a statement and see whether you agree with it. Australia has monumentally stuffed up an opportunity to get energy policy right over 20 years.
I'm going to say yes and no. Okay. Policy, yeah, you're absolutely right on policy that we have missed a lot of opportunities, and we continue to miss a lot of opportunities. But I'll say that there's really two Australias. There's 2 ways you can look at that. There's the sort of political and media sphere, which is completely behind on this energy transition and quite a mess. And then there's what's actually happening on the ground, and we're in much better shape than a lot of people realise. So, say a decade ago, Australia was about 7% renewable, and something close to 90, or maybe 85% of our power was coming from coal, a bit more from gas, and probably over 90% was coming from coal and gas. Where that's now, the month that just passed was about 30% renewable. We are that, and the average is 25% now. We're well on the way to 33% renewable within a couple of years and 50% renewable by the end of the decade, maybe even earlier. So things are moving, and they're moving faster than I think a lot of people realise. Some of it is due to government policy. The renewable energy target was a major reason for Australia getting moving, and rooftop solar. It's phenomenal. Like no other country on the planet has moved as quickly on domestic rooftop solar, as Australia has. Nearly 1 in 3 households now have solar panels on the roof, which is phenomenal.
I've always been very confused about the situation with rooftop solar, and especially when the politicians talk about the stability of the grid, and where we had solar and renewables being blamed for the failure of the South Australian grid during a storm. Now, is having renewables as a major source of input into the electricity grid, does that inherently make the grid unstable?
Not inherently. It's managing the grid has always been a challenge. It's to keep the grid stable, you have to exactly match supply and demand to this, on a second by second basis. If they get out of whack, then the frequency changes, and if the frequency changes too quickly, you start doing damage to you do damage to all sorts of infrastructure, and then the grid collapses. So it's incredibly important that you meet supply and demand the whole time, and that has always required a whole fleet of generators with different capabilities. So back in the 20, 30 years ago, you really only had coal, a little bit of gas, and hydro, and so you're constantly tweaking those throughout the day, and monitoring the change in frequency very, very closely and adjusting. So it's adjusting on a second to second basis. So that's always been a challenge. Now, we've moved from about maybe 20 years ago, there was probably less than 100 generators in the national electricity market. Now there are about 600 medium to large size generators, and then the sort of 2.5 million small generators on people's roofs. And we still have to manage the grid on a second to second basis. Now, when you've got that many players in the grid, it becomes a lot more complicated. It's fair, absolutely fair to say that it is more of a challenge than it used to be to balance the grid. But is the grid unbalanced more than it used to be? No, not at all. We're keeping our grid very stable. It's been very reliable. Yeah, that South Australian blackout was 4 years ago last week. It was a fascinating incident. I've read the report several times. There's so much in it, in what went on. But no, it wasn't because of some people thought that the wind farms had it was too windy or not windy enough or something like that, and the grid collapsed because of that. But it was actually a very complex series of events that caused it to collapse. Starting with 3 tornadoes ripping through the state that ripped out
the transmission
power lines.
lines.
Now, it wasn't that the power couldn't get through, but it sent major faults on the line. There were something like 6 major faults over about a 90-second period, and that caused some wind turbines to turn off. Their protection systems tripped, and when they tripped, then that caused currents across Victoria flowing into South Australia to cause that connected to trip, and one thing after it led to another. But it all started off with tornadoes, believe it or not, in South Australia. So yeah, it's complex managing the grid. It's always been complex. Luckily, we've got a lot better technologies now for managing the grid. it's. I guess no one wants to go back. I don't think anyone wants to go back to an only a coal, gas, and hydro. When our hydro is so small, it'd be more expensive and a lot more polluting. And Australians love their solar panels on the roof. Now, how we manage all those solar panels is becoming an issue as they're becoming a significant generator. But we're onto that as well.
It would seem to me that to really dumb it down, the art of managing the grid is about consistency, managing the strength is the wrong word, but the flows coming in from the different sources. Logic tells me, as a non-engineer, that batteries would seem to be an essential part of ameliorating that kind of issue. Am I right in thinking that, or is that completely non-scientific?
No. Batteries are very handy, and we're seeing that there are, I think there are about 5 or 6 significant size grid batteries on the network, and there are literally thousands, and I mean maybe even tens of thousands now of household batteries connecting to the network. So we're the highest per capita of solar in the world, of rooftop solar, but we're the largest market of household batteries. So not even per capita. Australia buys more household batteries than any other country on the planet. Look, batteries are great, but they're not the cheapest way of balancing the grid at the moment. If you've got a hydro plant that was built 50 years ago, and long ago paid off, and huge amount of power that can come out of those hydro stations, that's a very cheap way of balancing the grid. We're seeing the crossover point now where batteries are cheaper than gas for some types of quick response. So we'll see more and more batteries, but even one thing to remember is we don't have a centrally planned grid. We made a decision 20 or so years ago to privatise most of the network in Australia and to introduce a market. So the government doesn't actually choose what connects to the grid. People, developers, investors, energy companies, choose to make investments into what they think will be profitable in the market. So if you want to see what's profitable or what makes sense economically, you just follow what the market's doing. And the market's not building new gas, certainly not building. We haven't built a coal power station in Australia for 11 years. That was over in Western Australia, 11 years ago. And I think there's only been 2 pretty small gas power stations built in the last decade in Australia. So almost all is going into wind, solar, and increasingly batteries. Because our energy market and particularly the electricity market is privatised, is that making it difficult for communities to make their own decisions about how they provide power for themselves? So I'm thinking with Australia's spread out population and then really regionalised centres, would it make sense for townships that are hundreds of miles from another major centre to be using wind, solar, and batteries rather than being on the grid? Funny you should ask. So I was very heavily involved with a community wind farm we built the wind farm 10 years ago. We were in construction and it started generation 9 years ago. The Hepburn Community Wind Farm just near Daylesford. Yep. It's 2-turbine wind farm, 4 megawatts, and it generates about as much power as the local town Daylesford and much of Hepburn Springs use. So that was a project where the town people, group in town came together and decided that they wanted to have, rather than bring our power in from coal power stations 300 kilometres away, we could take a significant amount of control of our energy future by owning a big chunk of our own generation. So that's that project made a lot of sense. It's up there churning out power, day in, day out. There's a lot of people in that community have put solar panels on their roof and putting batteries in, and the Hepburn Wind Project is helping people now put in. They've found a supplier of second-hand, low-kilometre import electric vehicles that they're buying on bulk for, doing all bulk buys of everything you can to reduce your, your carbon footprint. And so Hepburn's not the only project. There's a mini hydro project up in Warburton in Victoria. There's literally dozens of community solar farms throughout the country. It's quite an interesting idea for communities that have got the passion to do it. But there are some challenges in doing it. Companies are now building projects 100 times bigger than what a community could ever envisage building, and when they start to get to that kind of scale, they have competitive advantages. But back, in areas where there are particular grid constraints or particular community concerns to do so, or they're underserved, they're definitely opportunities for community to invest in their own power future. So there's and I know that Helen Haynes, the member for Indi, has done a lot of work recently on showing how models for community-owned energy can work. She's a real champion for that. And I think we're going to see quite a few more projects.
Okay, so has government policy, either state or federal, limited the ability for communities to explore those options? Like, is there always a preference to a bias in policy making and perhaps financial support towards the power generators and the owners and distributors?
Look, I don't think there's been explicitly any policy that's helped or hindered. Certainly none that's helped. Nothing explicit that's hindered, but generally the larger the project, the more efficient it's going to be at attracting capital, or maybe 10 years ago the average project in Australia was a 50 megawatt project, and now people are building 300 megawatts and talking about up to 1,000 megawatts. So projects are getting much, much bigger, and it's difficult for small projects to have similar economics. There definitely are a fair few economies of scale, and I think it's sort of the way it's going to be, that the majority of projects are going to be huge projects going forward. So if we do want communities to be, to own part of their infrastructure, and there are other benefits to doing so. Like one thing, when we were building our project near Daylesford, there were some mega projects that were proposed for other communities, and the communities around them really didn't like them. If you're a relatively small community and a foreign company comes in and says they want to build 300 turbines surrounding your community, that's not many communities want that.
No.
But if you're a small community and it's locally driven, and someone, and you get a group going together and a few hundred members, and your proposal is just to build 2 turbines, or maybe 2 to 10 turbines on the edge of town, that's a very different proposition. So when we start looking at the social aspects of what kind of what kind of an environment we want, how do we want people to interact with their energy, I think there are some redeeming factors that make it worth supporting smaller projects.
Okay, visual prop time. That's a lump of coal.
What is that?
That's my pretend. That's my pretend lump of coal, because I didn't have one handy.
Don't be afraid.
No,
it's just a lump of coal. Yeah.
Carbon capture and storage. I feel like it's being rammed into us from both ends. Now, I've over about 5 years continually put out to anyone. Can someone please tell me or show me anywhere in the world where there is a carbon capture and storage plant that is working and that is not still being classified as research? Is there one?
Okay. So, yeah, there is. And I know carbon capture and storage is a basket of technologies. It's a whole lot of technologies, and there are a number of technologies on the capture side. How do you get hold of a stream of concentrated, or pure carbon dioxide? Then there's sort of the transport and compression, and then there's the injection underground. And if you're putting together a CCS project, it's going to require 2 or 3 of those technologies from a whole lot of options. So let's talk about carbon capture storage on coal. If you have a coal power project and you want to add CCS, you've got to get the carbon dioxide out of the flue gases. So you burn the coal in the boiler, and up comes a whole bunch of nasties. You've got particulate matter. You've got there's all sorts of they're called SOx and NOx, sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides, and then there can be heavy metals. There can be sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, and then of course there's a bunch of unburnt. There's air that has not been used in the that's gone through the process, and a fair bit of carbon dioxide. Now you're only interested in the carbon dioxide, so you have to put it through a process of post combustion capture, where you separate all of those items, pull out the carbon dioxide. That's a very expensive process. There's only 2 projects in the world where that's been done at any scale, and by any scale, it's still small. I mean, there's been a few tiny little research desktop projects, but there have only been 2 that have been at scale, and even this scale is not very big. Like the biggest, I think, is 240 megawatts, which is 1/10 the size of the biggest coal generator in New South Wales. So, reasonably small. And the post-combustion capture captures, in that case, I think about 60% the CO2 in the stream. Then they compress it, and in that particular case, that was the Petronova plant. They push it underground and into a nearby oil field, and its job is to push new oil up to the surface. So you're capturing the carbon in order to release oil, which gets burnt and releases more carbon. Put that aside. So that was the largest coal plus CCS project in the world, and after 3 years, it was mothballed about 3 months ago.
Because it's too expensive?
Sorry?
Because it was too expensive? Is that why?
Yeah, it didn't. They couldn't justify the cost of it. The only way it could make any money is by through the sale of the oil, and there's been a crash in the oil price, so the project didn't make sense. So it's been turned off, and it was a pretty crazy project. When they attached the CCS project to part of the plant, just to test this technology, really, they had to build a gas power station next door to power the CCS plant. CCS takes a huge amount of energy.
And I'm assuming the emissions from the gas plant are not captured and are just released.
No, they weren't. They weren't. It was really just sort of a demonstration of whether.
And that was really the point of my question. If you look at carbon capture and storage holistically, every example that I've seen, if you look at the totality of the emissions that are generated, either at the front end or the side or the back end of the CCS plant, they don't work. They don't work for what they're being sold to do.
There's only one moderately sized CCS project on coal working in the world, and that's Boundary Dam in Canada. It's been operating since, I think, think 2014, and I'd be surprised if it's still operating in a decade from now. It also is a loss-making exercise. But let's unfortunately in Australia, when we talk about CCS, that seems to be mostly what we talk about is CCS on coal.
That's because the government seem to say whenever someone says, look, the problem with coal is it's too expensive or it's too dirty or whatever. They're the two arguments. Their argument is, but CCS.
Yeah. So, look, we'll never see I'm pretty confident we'll never see CCS at scale on coal in Australia, possibly never anywhere in the world.
So why are we wasting time?
Let me tell you two other uses. Now, the next way along the line, the largest CCS project in the world is on the Gorgon LNG project in Western Australia. So Chevron built a plant. I think it's about close to 10 million tonnes a year of carbon dioxide is let into the environment from that plant. And Chevron, when they permitted the project back, might have even been 15 years ago, they committed to putting CCS on part of the project. And so what happened in that particular gas field when they pull the gas up from where it's been sitting underground for millions of years, there just happens in that particular field to have a high percentage of carbon dioxide. So you poke a hole in the ground, you find a big reserve of gas. Sometimes there's a lot of CO2, sometimes there's not. It just depends on, it just goes with the reservoir. This particular field had a lot of carbon dioxide, and you have to separate the carbon dioxide. Every gas plant in the world separates the CO2 out before it turns it into LNG. Because you're refrigerating the LNG down to the methane down to very, very cold temperatures, well below the freezing point of carbon dioxide, and you've got to remove the carbon dioxide first. So they're already doing where I told you before that extracting the CO2 out in coal is very expensive post-combustion because you've got all the other nasties. When you're doing it in the gas industry, you've got to do it anyway. So your capture is basically free. That's normally the expensive part. They also are sitting above a whole lot of geology that are suitable for putting the carbon dioxide underground. So they at Gorgon, they put 40% of the CO2 from the plant underground, and it's in geology that I'm assured will stay there forever. So I'd prefer we weren't extracting gas, but given that we're extracting, that it's I'd rather that CO2 stays underground than goes into the atmosphere. If it didn't, it would add close to 1% of Australia's emissions a year from that single plant are being prevented from going underground. Now that's we've got I think about 10 LNG trains in Australia. That's the only plant where we have where the CO2 is put underground. If carbon capture and storage is so awesome, we should make sure it's on every single one of them. There's at Longford here in Vic. It's not an LNG facility, but they pull the gas out of Bass Strait and then it goes into the main gas power supply. But they have to extract the CO2 first. They just vent it straight up into the atmosphere. 1 million tonnes a year goes from the Longford plant up into the atmosphere. I would prefer that. First, I prefer that we move ourselves off gas, but if we're going to be using gas, let's get that CO2 and capture and put it underground. Now, not everyone will agree with me on that, but I want to give you one more example. I visited a plant in Belgium last year. It's an Australian technology on a cement plant. They've developed. Well, when you make cement, the highest emitting part of the cement making is you have started with crushed limestone, put it through a cyclonic kiln, I guess, and heat it over 1,000 degrees, and it breaks the calcium carbonate down into calcium oxide and releases a whole lot of carbon dioxide. So when you make cement, I think it's on the order of, I think it might be on the order of about 5% or 7% of global emissions come from making cement.
That's right.
It's huge.
Yep.
And this Australian company has developed a process that can extract almost all the carbon dioxide from making cement, get it into a pure CO2 stream using no more energy or cost than existing processes, and you could then stuff that underground. And if we could reduce global emissions by 7% by stuffing it underground, and of course you've got to make sure it's in geology that can accept it and that you're not putting it into aquifers. And I would much rather we have processes. Maybe we should be inventing cement 2.0 that doesn't, that has a whole different chemistry. I don't know, but I'm using a lot of words to say CCS is a whole lot of things, and whereas there are, I think, some interesting and constructive uses for CCS, we've been or the technology has been hijacked by the coal propaganda lobby. The coal industry doesn't want CCS, right? Because they want CCS to exist as an idea. Yeah. But if you said tomorrow, okay, every coal power station has to put CCS on, they would kick and scream and tell you why the technology won't work. They don't want the technology on their plants. They just want the technology to exist to buy them cover. So, it's been used in Australia as a smokescreen. It's a real shame because we might there's one last bit of CCS I didn't talk about, and that's what they call BECCS, bioenergy CCS. And that's if let's say we find some amazing plant that makes an oil, grows in areas that are not environmentally sensitive, doesn't compete with food, and grows really, really well. I've seen people suggesting seaweed can be harvested like this. And you run it through a process and you get out an oil substitute, and then you're left with something that you can burn. If we burn it, capture all the emissions from that and stick the carbon dioxide underground, that process will be taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it back under the ground. So we've spent the last 200 years taking carbon from the ground and putting it up into the atmosphere. If we have processes that can work the other way, take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back underground, then we can reverse some of the damage we've done. So there's some merit, I think, in looking into bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So please, segment coal CCS, which is a lot of rubbish, from all the other possibly interesting aspects of CCS.
Yeah. Okay. Now,
does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I want to go back to the whole soil issue or go onto that in a minute. But first, I want to discuss gas more generally with you. Now, I saw this graphic that energy.gov.au came out, and I only saw it because you retweeted it from Tom Swan. Right. And Tom said,
I think I know which one is this. This is it's called a Sankey chart.
The gas industry itself now burns more gas than all of Australian manufacturing. More than 3/4 of Australia's gas is exported, and exporting gas requires burning vast amounts of gas. Now, it seems to me that we are backing a process to chase export dollars that can't possibly be ameliorated in a big way from a climate change standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a disaster for Australia in many ways. What's happened in the gas sector in the last 15 years or so. We used to have ample gas for industry in Australia, and it used to be cheap, and we didn't use a hell of a lot of it. And about 15 years ago, our gas industry, there were two technologies that changed everything. One was fracking. All of a sudden we had a technology that could get gas out of areas that was previously thought previously was completely uneconomic. It was still more expensive than our conventional gas, but we could see that gas was much more expensive overseas, and there was a new technology called LNG where we could liquefy the gas. It was originally thought of as crazy, the idea that you would, chill gas down to minus whatever temperature and put it in massive carriers and send them across the sea. Like, that would have just seemed completely crazy. And we spent, it was, I think, on the order of $60 billion building these LNG trains. And as soon as we connected Australia's markets, international markets, our gas price tripled. In many cases, much more than that. Some people were spending. I think some people went from spending $4 to $20 a gigajoule. So,
and can we clarify that the price only increased because we have a world parity pricing policy? Is that right? The price to produce it,
not even a policy. Just we didn't do any. We didn't protect ourselves. From
the price to produce it here didn't actually increase, but we are involved in agreements that we had to sell it at a price that was
Santos, who were a big part of this, announced to their shareholders the reason that they were doing this is they wanted to increase the price of gas. This was a very deliberate strategy to increase the price of that gas because gas was too cheap in Australia, So one of my colleagues at Melbourne University, Professor Mike Sanderford, has calculated that this has cost the average Australian $500 a year since over the last 5 years. $500 a year it's cost us in having the gas price increased as much as it is. So, we monumentally stuffed up. Interestingly, over in WA, they saw this coming, and they. And before us, they introduced what's domestic reserve requirement. What they said is that 15% of all gas that is extracted in Western Australia has to be reserved for the local market. And as a result, they have two prices. They have a very cheap, super cheap local price and world parity price on all their exports. So West Australia is having quite an economic boom, on gas-based manufacturing that we just won't see on the East Coast because we didn't do this domestic reserve. So it's been a disaster for Australian companies that use gas because their prices have gone up significantly. It's been a disaster for the communities where the coal seam gas has gone through and pockmarked previously, pristine areas pockmarked with these literally hundreds and hundreds of short-term wells, Chevron, I don't think, has paid a cent of royalties for or taxes on their extraction. Australia hasn't done well economically based on it. And not even a large amount of jobs. I think in Western Australia there's a total of 11,000 jobs in the gas sector, which is there are 100 industries in WA that would employ more people than that. So it's really hard to and then of course a very large amount of carbon dioxide and methane. A lot of our emissions in Australia come from the leakage from the gas sector. So there's almost no metric in which the shift to gas, more gas extraction or the export has had any benefit for ordinary Australians.
Coal seam gas, fracking, that's being latched onto by some state governments as a panacea for all sorts of problems and as a generator of jobs. In the economic analysis of fracking, do the risks to water, the water table, and the cost of repairing any adverse environmental effects, are they ever put into the equation?
Short answer, no, they're not. But look, I don't think the states are. I don't think the states are pushing. So Victoria has a ban on fracking. New South Wales has. I think they had a moratorium, but it was lifted based on a very, very long list of conditions. Now, conditions aren't necessarily followed, and
they're never enforced.
There are still risks, but certainly New South Wales is not an easy place to frack. Queensland fracking went crazy there, and there have been there have been all sorts of issues in some areas. I certainly can't speak for the whole of the fracking industry in Queensland, but there are some well documented issues where it's gone wrong. But one thing we do know about the coal seam gas sector is that the emissions. So the highest emissions from gas are not from the burning of it, but from the leakage of gas. Not just through the pipes and valves and everything else, but when you start changing the hydrology dramatically in an area, I don't know if you've seen those pictures of gas bubbling through creeks or coming up through lands, and people can actually set the river on fire. That gas has a major impact on Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And it's very poorly monitored and not managed.
And it's not monitored well. It's not managed, and where it is monitored, managed, and the effects are known, I can't think of any example where a company has been made to fix it. They might get a fine, but I can't recall anybody being made to repair or ameliorate the damage that they've done.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that either. It's a little. It's not quite the same. It's not the same technology, but there's that technology that's been tried of gasifying coal, so that people have had uneconomic coal deposits. It's not the coal's such poor quality, or there's so much overburden that it's not worth digging up. But a technology has been tried where you set fire to it underground, and when it burns in a low oxygen environment, such as underground, it sends out or it gives off a gas, like a coal gas that can be captured and then purified and turned into the gas that you can sell, just like coal seam gas. That's been tried a couple of times in Australia, and one of the places where it was tried in Queensland, unsurprisingly, it got out of control and destroyed an aquifer. And there's an area around that project where the previously pristine water that was used for agriculture can never be used again. And by the time it got to court, the company had long evaporated, and no one was around to be responsible to clean it up.
Socialise the losses, mate. Socialise the losses.
Yeah, socialise the loss, privatise the profits.
Yep.
That's the way.
Soil carbon. There was a big movement, I guess, about biochar and things like that. Is it a viable strategy for agriculture to be returning carbon into the?
Look, okay. So the first thing, it's not nonsense. Second thing is, the focus on it over the last decade has significantly been because the government doesn't want to do what needs to be done, and we've had. And this is what the CCS is about. It's what it was only 6 or so years ago. Greg Hunt was talking about using coal dust in diesel engines as some new energy technology. There's always something new to be done that's not what actually needs to be done. And soil carbon, like CCS, it's not nonsense. There's some good science in it. You can have agricultural practices that destroy soil carbon, and the soil and that carbon ends up in the atmosphere, or you can have agricultural practices that integrate more and more carbon into the soil, which is good for water retention, good for productivity, and sequesters. You can sequester millions of tons of carbon that way. We're still at the relatively early stages of a full understanding about soil carbon. So you can have some practices that work really well, and then you have a drought or some other event comes through and it liberates all that carbon back from the soil back into the environment. But we are learning a fair bit. And what the announcement was recently is that if we're going to have systems that pay people to put carbon underground, we want to make sure that we know how much is being put there and we know that it stays there. And at the moment, we don't have very good technologies that can. For that to be effective, we need to have cheap ways of monitoring and verifying. We need, if someone says they've put 1 million tons of carbon underground, we need to be able to check that and periodically check that it's still there. If we're going to pay people to do it, and so that's. The announcement the other day about soil carbon was really to invest in those monitoring and verification technologies.
I might be throwing something at you from left field that you aren't really aware of. But again, it was another 20 years ago when I was studying horticulture, it was all about agroforestry. That was going to be the saviour.
Yep.
And a heap of money got put into projects under the Landcare banner. And we know that trees are very efficient at capturing carbon and hanging on to it. So why haven't we had any kind of debate or discussion in this country where we have a whole lot of marginal agricultural land, extremely marginal, and that we are year after year putting public money into drought relief, flood relief, sort of watercourse embankment regeneration and whatnot? Why haven't we looked at just direct seeding and preserving the biodiversity of areas and paying farmers to be the stewards of the land? Why haven't we had a serious discussion about that?
So, Grant, we sort of have, but at a much less ambitious scale than I think you're talking about. So, firstly, yes, the land sector can be a major sink of carbon, can be a major part of us reducing our net carbon emissions. And this was recognised long ago, and we set up there was a scheme set up in the more than a decade ago, the Carbon Farming Initiative, which developed a large number of methodologies for recognising carbon that was captured by the land sector mainly, including reforestation. So, and now those and there is a program. It was rebranded the Emissions Reduction Fund in 2014 and rebranded last year as the Climate Solutions Fund, and it buys around about roughly 12 million tonnes a year of carbon abatement. There's literally hundreds of projects, farmers that are being paid all around the country for having locked up carbon with all these different methodologies. So some of it, I know a farmer out in Western Australia who's got a large area of land on the edge of the wheat belt where the salination of the of the soil and meant that it's very marginal agricultural land. And for on the order of $20 to $30 a tonne, that's my dog in the background, on the order of $20 to $30 a tonne, he can economically lock up carbon, for effectively, effectively for good over land that was just degraded and not useful for anything else. And of course, there's the biodiversity aspect of if it was just old sort of scrubby wheatland that was just struggling on with salination issues. It's now new forest, and this guy's really passionate about making it biodiverse plantings as well. So great stuff. But this only happens if there is a program. The 12 million tonnes a year is tiny that we're doing. If we if we wanted to, just to put it in context, Australia's around about 540 million tonnes a year are being emitted, and this project takes 12 of them back. In fact, this whole program, which the taxpayers have committed $4 billion over the life of this, over the 20, I think it might be 25-year life of this whole project, of all, of everything in the Climate Solutions Fund. That's not even enough to offset what Chevron is going to put into the atmosphere from its 2 LNG projects. So we're doing this stuff, but we're just doing it at such a small scale, and that's because. So why are we not doing it? It's because there's no federal, will to do anything more than what we're currently doing. To do anything more than what they say is the, what they think is the bare minimum that they can get away with.
Yeah, and I mean, just paying lip service to it in a time of climate crisis, and I'm saying that, I'm not putting those words in your mouth, just seems to me to be doing nothing. And it's interesting that a government that is so against having any kind of price on carbon can formulate a price to pay a farmer in an obscure program that nobody knows about. Because they must formulate a price.
It is a price on carbon, but they used when Greg Hunt destroyed the carbon price back in 2014, he rebranded the Carbon Farming Initiative, which was one of it was one of the initiatives for I guess for the energy and the climate or the carbon transition, decarbonisation process that was started under the Gillard government. Or maybe it's probably fair to say it was, that was just a major enhancement of programs before then, even dating back. We've got to give John Howard credit for the renewable energy target. He brought that in, and it's been Australia's most successful climate policy. But putting that aside for now, the climate or the emissions reduction fund was a mechanism. I think at the time, didn't Malcolm Turnbull said it was a fig leaf of a policy that you put over to hide the government's inaction towards doing anything on climate change. But the emissions reduction fund, it does some good things. It just needs to be, it needs to be 50 times bigger than it is right now. And what really bugs me is that the carbon price that we had back in 2014 was structured in such a way that we were, within a couple of years, set to be connected to the European scheme. And if we were, our farmers would be exporting carbon credits to Europe. Europe would be paying Australian farmers to plant these trees on the marginal lands that you spoke of before. So we could have had billions of dollars flowing into the country, helping Europe decarbonise, at the same time as reforesting lots of Australia with all the biodiversity and employment and land care benefits of doing so. But we, for the same reasons, the political opportunism that we just decided to, that Tony Abbott decided to destroy the NBN. He decided to destroy the climate response, which had so much economic benefit for Australia, but wasn't to be.
Well, let's shift it to maybe some positives. And before we go on, hello, Taco Maniac 444. Comment here, Simon, that you might want to have a look at. You should be able to see that. Someone's got it on Twitch.
Hi, Taco Mania.
And your fig leaf comment, you made that at about the same time that popped up in my vision, which was why I was laughing. Very very apt for a fig leaf.
I didn't have the comments panel on. I do now. Thanks, Taco Mania.
So yes, Twitch, we love Twitch. Simon, let's try and find some positives, because I'm
plenty of positives. I'm actually very much an optimist.
Because my show's about what can individuals do to make a difference, what responsibility can they take on to make a difference, and one of the things that I've always been trying to do is do carbon offsetting. So is that something that you're aware of and that you do yourself?
Yeah, I do. Probably, I mean, the biggest. I'm on 100% green power at home. Drive an EV. So sort of some of those sort of fairly, and I recognise they all cost more, and I'm lucky that I'm in a position to do that. But the biggest carbon footprint that a lot of people have these days is or the biggest single one would be flying, and you can offset them either at the time of flight or later. But I want to talk a fair bit about individual action and systemic change, and I think that's a really interesting field. And I just want to just take it back to I read a fascinating article a couple of years ago about the Keep America Beautiful campaign, which the Keep Australia Beautiful campaign was based on. Do you remember? This is back to the 70s and 80s, I think, right? Where and it was the tidy towns movement. You'd come into a town and they were proud that they were a tidy town of the region, and then they would keep Australia Beautiful Day. Everyone would go out there with sacks and would pick up rubbish on the side of the road.
And Ian Kiernan with his Clean Up Australia Day.
Yep. So the article. So I don't know about the Australian movement, but the US movement came about. Post-war, the world discovered plastic, and it was an amazing material. For the first time, we could make things that we could never make before at a fraction of the cost of trying to make them out of more durable materials. Things just popped out of molds, and they were ridiculously cheap. And there was a whole new age of consumerism. Firstly, maybe of durable goods, but eventually just plastic bottles and plastic anythings that. And so this miracle product. Over a short amount of time, we started realising that it was a serious cause of litter. We were seeing more and more litter in our environment from this wonder material that didn't break down so easily. It was too cheap to care about reusing, but too durable to biodegrade away. So the plastics industry went from having this miracle product to something that people were starting to get pretty miffed about its impact on the environment, and the industry worked with the then rapidly maturing advertising industry to work out where do we how do we counter, what do we do about this rising tide of pushback against our wonderful product. And the advertising industry came up with Keep America Beautiful Day.
Oh, sorry. So,
With what, sorry? Not
I
recycling.
I thought you were heading to that other great lie that's been promoted lately, that like the smoking myth, that the plastics industry always knew that recycling was not a viable option for plastic, even though they've been promoting it, and we've investing in it as communities for 30 years, but it's never going to work.
So, and that campaign, it's, this is not a conspiracy theory. Go back and have a look. The phrase "litter bug" came from the advertising industry. It wasn't just something people made up. It was workshopped in focus groups, and they came up with the idea of a litter bug. And the idea was to push that the problem with plastic is not that it's durable and cheap. The problem is that the litter bug throws it out the window, and the problem is that people don't recycle it, and the problem is that, but basically it shifted responsibility for plastic
to the consumer,
from the producers to the consumer. And so I went down that's a long story to say I'm also weary when we start talking about individual responsibility for climate change. Look, we all, of course, do have we all have individual a share of responsibility for the collective, but we didn't get here because you make the wrong choices, and we're not going to get out of here because you make the right choices in what you do in your household.
Although
we get it.
I don't want to say you're wrong, but I would contend.
No, I want you to challenge me on this.
But I would contend that Australians over, let's say, 20 years have to take responsibility for where we are, and the only way we can rectify it is with our vote.
Yes. So that exactly. So we're about to converge here.
Oh, good. Good.
We're about to converge you. So people, every second day there's a list in some newspaper, magazine, or news source or website, whatever, saying, here's what you can do to reduce your emissions. Recycle your plastics.
But that's PR bullshit. That's all PR bullshit.
Yeah, exactly. And people would say, before, don't get a plastic bag at the shop. Bring your own bag. Now we sort of have to walk rather than have your kids walk to school rather than drive them, and all that. And that's all just playing around the edges, right?
That's bullshit. It doesn't make a difference. It makes you feel good, and then you can feel good about buying a fridge that's twice the size of the one that you really need, and that you're running a second old fridge to keep your beer cold. It's just a cover up for all the bullshit as a society that we do, and that we have to stop doing.
Exactly. So that's the trap. Is all those lists of all the little things you can do, and then the sort of bigger things like yes, putting solar on your roof is great, right? But the average Australian has a carbon footprint of I think 16 tonnes of CO2 per annum. If you have an average size house with an average number of people in it, and you put a solar panel, a solar array on the roof, you might reduce that by 1 tonne per person. Right, so great, what to do? But that doesn't, that putting solar on your roof doesn't let you off the hook. One thing talk about is if you run a campaign and you convince everyone to do all the normal things in the normal list, and let's say you convinced 1 in 5 households to follow, to do that. That'd be amazing if you could get 20% of people to do all that list, and if they do all those lists of things, they might reduce their emissions of their household by 20%. And if so 20% of the population does 20% of their emissions, that's a whopping 4% reduction, one time ever. which is really nothing in the scheme of things. Doesn't move the needle. We need to do far more than that as a society. And an example recently, I showed that there's one, I think the third biggest coal power station in New South Wales is called Vales Point. It's a little one that no one ever hears much about. Vales Point puts out more carbon dioxide than the entire Australian domestic airline industry. Every domestic flight, Qantas, Virgin, Rex, etc., Jetstar, all of those have a lower carbon footprint than this one coal power station in New South Wales. Right? So, as a society, there's a whole lot of low-hanging fruit. Like firstly, we need to get rid of these coal power stations as quickly as possible.
And there's only one way to do that. There is only one way to do that.
Well, rapid transition away.
No. Well, the New South Wales government will never do it. In the next 5 to 10 years, the current New South Wales government would not do it.
No, it won't be government. It won't be government led. It'll be market.
So the companies will have to do it. So we'll have to make a choice to pressure the companies to close it down. So that comes into things like boycotts. Do they work?
Yeah. One strategy I think is I've been watching quite closely are the shareholder resolutions.
Yeah.
So there's a group, Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, ACCR, and they, for instance, they have a motion up at AG. It's on the agenda for AGL's AGM later this month, I think, where they are as they've got 100 shareholders together, 100 shareholders put up this resolution that the board is to present a plan for how they're going to shut down all their coal power stations over the next 12 years or something. Now that, I wouldn't be surprised if that motion fails this year. You probably only get 10% people voting for it, but it'll probably get 20% next year, and then as soon as it's at 50%, it's locked in. And
they'll have to do it.
So that's one of the ways people put pressure. Another way, you'd be surprised how much pressure solar panels are putting on these coal power stations.
Just before we move on to another positive, is that the power station that the government has signalled that they want no matter what AGL say, that they want it to keep going, or is that a different?
The government's fixated on that. AGL owns Liddell, which is the one that the government
Liddell's the one that government.
They're obsessed with it. It makes no sense. It will shut down. We don't need it.
Look, I'm going to be facetious, but it just makes me wonder the discussion that we have with guys like Canavan and taking a lump of coal into Parliament and dreaming up these special policies for one power station. It makes me wonder whether there's a fetish element or something in it, because their thinking is so loopy.
Yeah, it's I would call it culture warriors, but it is almost like a fetish, isn't it? It's like it's their identity that they have to fight for it. Even you can sit down and show them that it makes no economic sense whatsoever, and it doesn't matter to them.
And it's like people who are addicted to things that are really risky. It's like how do people justify risky behaviour? Because I can't stop. I can't stop.
Or another way, it's like someone who's a fanatical fanatical fan of a football team. It's like it's harmless, right? But these guys are
that's right.
fanatical followers of Team Coal, right? And it's like what?
But it's not. But that's not harmless. Following St Kilda is harmless to everyone else. But being a Collingwood supporter like me, it might offend you, but I'm not going to hurt you by supporting Collingwood. But
Yeah.
but
No, but it's the same sort of it's that same kind of passion. That people would have for a football team that is it's about belonging to a side, right?
yeah,
It's,
maybe it is that simple. I'm so glad that David Attenborough has really lifted the pressure that he is able to exert on sort of dinosaur style governments. Can we get what do you think, Simon? Are we at a point in this country where the people might wake from their slumber and push these blokes, prod them, push them, bash them with the proverbial baseball bat, or is it going to have to get worse?
We are really, really lucky that the economics are changing so rapidly. I mean, so it's sort of keen observers would hopefully have noticed that the federal government, which was talking about, was 2 years ago, was talking about clean coal, right? And I have to do scare quotes around for those who are just listening to the audio. Scare quotes around clean coal, and
as I polish my coal.
They were talking about it.
Yes.
Yeah, and they were thinking about a thing called heli coal.
Another fantasy. Yeah.
Have you? I don't know. Most people might have noticed that the government hasn't mentioned that for any of those things for 18 months or so. That they've finally accepted that was a fantasy. Then we're back to CCS, which is part of that. But don't worry, that'll blow over soon. And we're
so they gave up their subscription to Heli, the porn magazine, and now they're still getting CCS.
Well, now, but you've noticed that everyone would have noticed that they've moved on to gas right now. Now, gas has the same. Gas is possibly even less economic than coal. So this is just a phase that they're going through on the way. Eventually they'll get there, but it's the sheer weight of economics is pushing them. They're pushing back against a tide that they cannot hold back. So almost every dollar that's been invested in energy in the last 15 years in Australia, almost every one of those dollars has been into renewables and increasingly storage.
Private dollars, you mean? Private dollars, yeah.
The renewable energy target and the ARENA with their supporting pre-commercial technologies and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation supporting sort of early stage commercial technologies have been very important government assistance to this. The current federal government has tried to kill all three of those programs. They've tried to kill, but they haven't been able to get them through the Senate because they're wildly popular. But Australian industry, it's the clean energy sector in Australia has really matured a lot in the last 5 to 10 years, but also Australia's riding on the coattails of the great advances being made around the world. We haven't talked much about what's happening in Europe, but
that can be next time if you're up for it.
Yeah, but basically Germany went really hard early on. They decided to jump head first into a renewables transition and invested heavily in solar power. It makes almost no sense Germany has a fraction of the sun that we do in Australia, but they still have about 2 or 3 times as much solar power in Germany as we have in all of Australia. They invested in solar when it was very expensive, and they helped bring solar down the cost curve, and we benefit from that now. So, in the early days of solar, it was horrifically expensive, but through investing, buying more of it, Germany helped bring down. And if I meet Germans who are in the energy sector, I always thank them for subsidising our solar panels. Yeah. We really
and uh, and we haven't gone anywhere near hydrogen.
Really, just love it.
We we haven't
No, we haven't.
we haven't
We've
even
run out
got
of
to
time for that
hydrogen.
today, I think.
No, so I will invite you back on to maybe talk about what Europe have been doing, the issues that we've got with America, what China are doing, and is hydrogen a viable option? I mean, is it safe? Does it meet the economic tests, and what are the environmental concerns with hydrogen, and even hydro hydro pumping for the
Pumped hydro. Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
I'd be happy to come back and talk about them, Grant.
that would be
probably
great.
running a bit tight on time for today to launch into those because they're pretty big fields.
Oh, they are.
But,
and what I want to try and do is just explore that little issue again about individual responsibility. Because I'm completely aware of that PR fluff. So let's forget all that bullshit. But can you
on that bullshit? There's one that I'm haunted by. There's a there was an amazing thinker, David McKay, from Cambridge University, who sadly passed about 4 years ago, I think. But he had a very powerful saying, which is, if we all do a little bit, then together we will achieve a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? If you people have been told unplug your phone charger at night because it'll, if everyone unplugs their phone charger at night, well, you unplug your phone charger at night, you'll save about 0.01% of your emissions.
Yeah.
0.001.
Yeah.
And if we all do it, then we'll save 0.001% of humanity's emissions. So that's around the edges. The big stuff. Is about raging.
I have an ongoing discussion with my housemate because I leave two computers going, and he's always on about my standpoint about the environment. But both of my computers are old, second-hand. I didn't buy them. I've given them a second life. So I've saved more in choosing to use and repurposing old equipment than if I had have had a new energy efficient one and was turning it off at night, because the major expense
you'd have to do the sums, but and again, it depends where you get where your electricity comes from.
That's right. But the manufacturing cost, environmental cost, and the transportation and all that stuff has to be factored into anything that you do when you do the equation.
It has to be factored in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to finish it off, what is something an individual can do other than wait for the next election? What can somebody do to not so much feel good about themselves, but to actually put some sort of little dent in the footprint of the nation?
Well, I think I'll give you the longer game. I don't think we're going to get meaningful action on climate change until we have a minority government again in Australia. We need to have a strong crossbench of and I just we think about our crossbench now. We've got folks like Rebecca Sharkey, Helen Haynes, Sally Stegel,
Rex
Andrew
Patrick.
Wilkie. Yeah, in the Senate. Yep, and I'm sure I've forgotten some quality folks. But we came very close to having. Karen Phelps only missed out by a few hundred votes to retaining her seat there in Wentworth. If there was one more MP independent on that crossbench, they would have been in a position to negotiate to choose, as has happened on the crossbench back in 2010, we would have a very different country right now. We would be addressing this problem properly.
I always say to friends whenever they say, I'm not interested in politics, it never makes a difference, they're all the same, Tweedledum, Tweedledee, all those arguments. You just have a look at if you go to a dinner party of 8 or 9 people and one person votes differently, not necessarily independent, but if one person from that group votes differently in the Senate than they voted last time, we get a change. That's
the elections. It's not just one day. It's actually somewhere between 12 and 18 months to the next election. So if there's anything you can do to get an independent up in your electorate, or if your electorate's never going to have one, is there one near you that can help?
Or work on your council. Work on your local. Then that's when you work on your local council and your state bodies. And
local council is a great opportunity for change. There's a lot happening at the local level, and states are leading the action on climate mitigation, climate action. State governments are leading there. So, I really think that the biggest thing we can all do, by all means, do all the things that are on those lists of stuff you can do at home. Someone described to me recently, it's a bit like personal hygiene. It's like, by all means, brush your teeth and have a shave and whatever, and
one day,
and wash your hair and clip your toenails. By all means, do all that kind of stuff. But that's the basics. No one congratulates you for getting out of bed. They're the basics that yes, do them, and we will, and that's sort of the base level. But to fix these problems, we need government that cares about it, and we don't have government that cares about it now. And I think it's one of the highest impacts things we can do is work just to get just a couple more independents on the crossbench, and we would have a different country.
So it's really interesting, isn't it, that we've spent an hour and 20 minutes talking about energy policy and all the things wrapped around it, and it just comes down to raw politics. It doesn't matter what the best options are and how many people are going to produce reports and send them off to the government and talk about the best options. It's raw politics. It's all it comes down to in this country now.
Sadly, I guess we are nearly 26 million people all living on one patch of dirt, and we have to work out how we're going to live. How we're going to organise ourselves, and we have a system. The rules are reasonably well understood. If we want change, we know what we've got to do.
I hope you got as much out of that little chat with Simon as I did. Make sure you follow Simon on Twitter. Links are in the description if you'd like to know more and more and more about renewables and the efficiency of energy and the good choices that all of us can make. The next Monday Megaphone, we're going to be concentrating again on conservation and biodiversity, environment protection law and the issues around it. So I hope you can join me then. If you want to find out the updates, where we're streaming, when we're streaming, just follow @Bird Emergency on Twitter. Thanks for listening.